Dear Rector, dear colleagues and friends, we are facing a climate emergency. After a brief dip in global carbon dioxide emissions in 2020, in a year marked by a global pandemic, emissions are set to rise again in 2021. If we want to keep global warming below the safe level of 2 degrees Celsius, as suggested by the 2015 Paris Agreement, emissions need to fall rapidly and reach net zero soon after the middle of the century. Achieving the more ambitious goal and aspirational goal of staying below 1.5 degrees requires even greater efforts. If we fail, the social, environmental and economic impacts will be dire. It is therefore crucial to explore all possible regulatory levers to avoid climate disruption. When we think about the role of law in tackling the climate emergency, we often think about how law can address the negative social and environmental externalities caused by economic activities. In the context of climate change, this has led us to analyze the role of law in promoting carbon pricing and other policy instruments to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What lawyers have thought much less about is what Natasha Affolter calls the negative spaces of climate law. More specifically, what is the role of law in both enabling and potentially constraining the very economic activities that drive global environmental change? I will look into this question with a focus on the activity of fossil fuel production. The burning of fossil fuels, including coal, oil and gas, is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions and a major driver of climate change. This began to change when the environmental activist Bill McKibben wrote an essay in which he argued that the amount of carbon in global fossil fuel reserves was 5 times as high as the amount that could be safely emitted to stay below 2 degrees. McKibben's warning resonated in several reports and scientific articles that popularized the concepts of unburnable carbon and stranded assets, and suggested that some fossil fuel reserves needed to remain untouched. The recent Production Gap report even suggests that countries are planning to produce 50% more fossil fuels by 2030 than would be consistent with the 2 degrees goal, and 120% more than would be compatible with staying below 1.5 degrees. These studies have given rise to a transnational movement to leave fossil fuels in the ground. But what may have started as a slogan has slowly begun to move towards the center of the policy debate. Not only have religious leaders supported these calls, but also some countries, including New Zealand, Denmark and France, have begun to implement policies to limit fossil fuel extraction. Such policies are also emerging in the world's second largest greenhouse gas emitter, the United States. In a presidential campaign, now Vice President Kamala Harris called for the launch of global negotiations on the cooperative managed decline of fossil fuel production. Now, all this raises the question, what is the role of international law in regulating fossil fuel production in light of climate change goals? General international law is the main starting point for any such inquiry, with the core principle being the permanent sovereignty of nation states over their natural resources. Over time, this principle has been qualified by other principles, including that of prevention of environmental harm. And in addition to these general rules of international law, normative guidance can also be sought in specific bodies of international law. And in the following, I will look at 3 such bodies of relevance for fossil fuel production, namely international climate law, human rights law and investment law. Starting with climate law, the most concrete guidance can be found in the 2015 Paris Agreement. Although the Paris Agreement does not contain the words fossil fuels, its long-term goals imply certain limits for states. First, it is clear that from existing studies that fossil fuel production needs to be wound down to meet the agreement's temperature goals. And second, the Paris Agreement also calls on parties to make finance flows consistent with the pathway towards low greenhouse gas emissions, which suggests that states should phase down financial support for fossil fuel production. These long-term goals can be argued to create due diligence obligations for states to phase out their fossil fuel production as well as their financial support. However, it's important to note that commitments related to fossil fuel production are largely absent so far from the climate pledges put forward by governments, known in the Paris Agreement as nationally determined contributions. The Paris Agreement also suggests and also underscores the growing importance of ensuring a just transition. And this suggests that any shift away from fossil fuel production needs to take into account the impact on fossil fuel workers and fossil fuel dependent communities. Another set of normative guidance can be found in human rights law. There's a long-standing history of human rights abuses by some fossil fuel companies. Moreover, lobbying and misinformation efforts by some of these companies arguably constitute human rights violations. Generally, human rights law dictates that states are under an obligation to protect and fulfill human rights by preventing and redressing such abuses. States may also be deemed to violate human rights themselves by supporting or permitting fossil fuel production. And lastly, there is a growing recognition that human rights law can also directly impose obligations on corporate actors, including fossil fuel companies, to respect human rights. And another body of international law that is becoming increasingly relevant for regulating fossil fuel production is investment law. Through investment treaties, states offer protection to foreign investors against policy changes. This includes investors in fossil fuel production. With governments beginning to implement restrictions on fossil fuel production for environmental reasons, we have already seen the first investment disputes arising in countries such as Canada and France. Where investors win these cases, this may lead to significant amounts of compensation. Investment law may also exert influence before any dispute arises. The mere threat of an investment dispute may already delay or deter a government's plan to phase out fossil fuels. So far, I have aimed to show that an analysis of the applicable rules of international law can reveal what states and non-state actors need to do in terms of moving away from fossil fuel production to achieve climate change goals. However, it also has shown that in some cases, the guidance provided may be conflicting. So let me now turn to a more normative and forward-looking question. What should an international law response to leaving it in the ground actually look like? Here I will sketch its broad outlines, drawing on some basic principles of international law. First, following the principle of prevention of environmental harm, as well as that of intergenerational equity, a key part of the response should be that states phase out fossil fuel production, as well as their support for it, in line with the Paris Agreement's long-term goals. Moreover, to prevent climate harm and ensure that these long-term goals are actually met, states should carry out climate impact assessments of fossil fuel production. For instance, whenever a new coal mine or a new oil pipeline is being proposed. Second, drawing on the principle of intragenerational equity, states with greater ability to pay should provide support to developing countries to help them meet the cost of the transition away from fossil fuels. Moreover, knowing that many fossil fuel reserves are found in developing countries, it will be important to provide adequate protection for these countries against frivolous investment claims. Finally, the need to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights points to both substantive and procedural obligations. Among others, states should provide for a just transition away from fossil fuel production for both fossil fuel workers and fossil fuel dependent communities. Moreover, given the high stakes, and in line with existing international agreements on environmental rights, states need to allow for public participation in fossil fuel-related decision-making and share relevant information about fossil fuel projects and policies. Now, how then can international law help on leaving it in the ground take shape over time? As a first step, a small group of states could move forward and informally agree to coordinate their fossil fuel phase-out policies. Although it may be less likely that such informal coalitions would include major fossil fuel producers, including smaller countries such as small island states or least developed countries may also lend moral weight to any such initiative. Then in parallel, states could seek to realign the rules and practices of existing international agreements. In international climate law, this could mean that parties to the Paris Agreement begin to include commitments and information related to fossil fuel production in their nationally determined contributions, in their long-term climate strategies, and in their national reports submitted under the Paris Agreement. In international investment law, alignment could include renegotiating or, when necessary, withdrawing from or even terminating investment treaties. For instance, states could decide to exclude fossil fuel investments from the protections granted to them by the Energy Charter Treaty, which is currently undergoing a modernization process. Building on these first two steps, states could move forward by negotiating a specific treaty to limit fossil fuel production. There have been calls for the adoption of a fossil fuel non-proliferation treaty, which would be modeled after the International Regime for Nuclear Weapons. To be very clear, phasing out fossil fuel production in line with the Paris Agreement's climate change goals in a fair and equitable way will be a tremendous challenge. But if we are to tackle the climate emergency, we need to be bold, we need to be creative, and we need to leave all of the options on the table, including leaving fossil fuels in the ground. And with that, I would like to thank you for your attention. Kiitos.